Hey, welcome back everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment, and we're continuing our broadcasts Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, focused very heavily, at least for the time being, on this new coronavirus, this CCP virus. Today we're going to be going into this new scientific paper saying a lab origin of the virus should not be written off. We're also going to be looking at some of the investigations into the origins of this virus, which have recently taken a unique turn. And of course, it being Monday, we're going to be going over some questions from viewers, so stick around for that at the end of the show. Now, with that said, folks, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, we really need your support for this channel. Also, you want to go the extra mile, we do take donations. So first up today, this new scientific paper saying a lab origin of the virus should not be written off. Now, I'll go over the information on it first, and we'll discuss a bit more after. So first off, the New Zealand Herald reports, landmark study, virus didn't come from animals in Wuhan market. And it says, quote, the Mail on Sunday revealed that analysis of the coronavirus by specialist biologists suggests that all available data shows it was taken into the market by someone already carrying the disease. They say they were surprised to find the virus was already pre-adapted to human transmission, contrasting it to another coronavirus that evolved rapidly as it spread around the planet in a previous epidemic. It continues, the new research is clear in its finding. Quote, the publicly available genetic data does not point to cross-species transmission of the virus at the market. And that quote is attributed to Alina Chan, a molecular biologist, and Xing Jian, an evolutionary biologist. It continues stating their paper insists all routes for zoonotic, animal to human, transmission, in this case from bats, must be examined. It says, the possibility that a non-genetically engineered precursor could have adapted to humans while being studied in a laboratory should be considered. Now, this study was authored by scientists from the Department of Zoology and Biodiversity Research Center at the University of British Columbia, the Fusion Genomics Corporation, and the Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. So I'll read a quote from the report now. It says the CoV, the coronavirus, that is most closely related to SARS-CoV-2 is RATG13, a bat CoV coronavirus that was identified at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and originally isolated from the Yunnan province of China. RATG13 shares 96.2 genome identity with the Wuhan HU1 SARS-CoV-2 isolate. It says the most closely related pangolin CoV, MP789, shares only 84.1% and 84% genome identity with Wuhan HU1. No evidence as yet points to the adaptation of SARS-CoV-2, the current virus we're dealing with, for human infection in pangolins or the transmission of SARS-CoV-2 from pangolins to humans. In other words, again, debunking the narrative from the Chinese regime that a pangolin may have been the intermediary species. And this report is notably again suggesting that there may not have been an intermediary species, at least not in the wild. They're saying that when the virus spread in the Wuhan seafood market, this Hunan seafood market, that it had already been adapted to humans. And so how did this bat coronavirus become adapted to humans before spreading among humans? And that's why they're pointing to the possibility that it may have come from a lab. As it states, even the possibility that a non-genetically engineered precursor could have adapted to humans while being studied in a laboratory should be considered. And notably, again, them stating that this RATG13 bat coronavirus that was from Yunnan province of China and was being studied at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, this laboratory everyone's talking about in Wuhan that was studying viruses, seems to be the closest match. And you all may remember in the documentary from the Epoch Times investigating the origin of the Wuhan coronavirus, we actually point to the same data. And it's nice to see that our findings are being corroborated. We can't take credit for doing the initial research because that documentary, of course, looked at available research that had already been done and was out there. But what we did was we put the whole picture together. We basically followed different tracks of information. We didn't try to draw conclusions on it. But one of the main tracks we pointed to was this Yunnan bat coronavirus, notably that was being studied at this virology institute in Wuhan, and that notably was submitted to this virus databank by the Chinese military, the PLA. And we'll probably never get credit for it, but hey, it's good seeing our findings getting corroborated. So they're suggesting this was very likely a natural virus being studied at this laboratory that had somehow become adapted to humans at this laboratory already. In other words, possibly they were studying it and naturally this virus had become adapted to humans and then got out through their studies, notably, which would be different from a chimeric or man-made virus, but still a product, at least to some extent, of scientific research being done at a laboratory. And notably, this is also where a lot of the disinformation comes into play with trying to write off the idea that this came from a laboratory. Because a lot of reports, you see mainstream news outlets, talking points of government officials, they try to conflate the idea that lab origin automatically means bioengineered. They conflate the idea that lab origin means that it must be man-made, when that does not have to be the case. It could have been one of the 1,500 bat coronaviruses they were studying at this laboratory, notably which the Chinese regime had destroyed after this whole thing went down, which we'll be going into a bit later. But I think this report demonstrates the need for more investigations, and it's again very good to see reports first off corroborating research we also put together at Epoch Times, and also pointing to the possibility that this may have been a lab leak. Now, moving on into the investigations into the virus, now taking an interesting turn. So first off, 62 nations, including Australia, are backing an EU-led resolution calling for a probe into the origins of the virus. We've been talking about this for a bit, that Australia was calling up different countries, trying to get them to sign on to this investigation. Well, there have been some changes to the initial proposal, although it is now apparently going through. So hear me out on this. The devil's in the details. Now, this resolution will be submitted this week to the WHO Assembly, the World Health Organization Assembly. The diplomatic breakthrough has come with a price. All references to China, the epicenter of the original outbreak, have been stripped from the motion. There's even hopes that China could back the probe because it has been framed without reference to how and where the virus originated. So, in other words, in order to get all the countries to sign on to this, they have 62 countries, they had to remove the idea that it may have come from China from the proposal for the investigation. In other words, now if this investigation goes through, it will not necessarily limit its investigations into a China origin, which is what the Chinese regime has been calling for, notably. And it calls for an impartial, independent, and comprehensive evaluation, but would have the WHO Assembly to establish this. But notably, this is being presented as also an investigation into the WHO, so it is unlikely that the WHO itself, at least in my analysis and what I understand of this, unlikely the WHO itself will be the one forming the investigation. Very likely this will be done by member states. It's not stated too clearly, to be honest. But notably, this is a quote. It says it will, quote, review experience gained and lessons learned from the WHO Coordinated International Health Response to COVID-19. Now, author and commentator Brahma Chalani wrote this on Twitter. He said, quote, Australia, India, Japan, China's partner Russia, and 58 other nations will jointly move a resolution at the WHO Assembly tomorrow demanding an early, quote, impartial, independent, and comprehensive inquiry into the pandemic, including the WHO's actions. And so we'll have to see how involved the WHO is in this investigation into itself, because this is being presented to the WHO Assembly. We'll also have to see whether this will be a fair investigation, because notably the Chinese regime has been backing a WHO investigation.
China supports the idea of a comprehensive review of the global response to COVID-19, after it is brought under control to collect experiences and address deficiencies. All along, China has acted with openness, transparency, and responsibility. We've done everything in our power to support and assist countries in need.
It has been saying that it will not allow any country to investigate the origin of the virus, at least not a China origin. It will not accept any investigations, but it says it will accept a WHO investigation.
To be successful, we must all commit to mutual ownership and accountability. One way to do that, proposed by the Africa Group last year, is through a system of universal periodic review, in which countries agree to a regular and transparent review of each nation's preparedness.
And why would they allow the WHO? Why would they ask the WHO to do that while not trusting any other source? We can take from that what we would like. Personally, I think it's because the WHO to this point has very closely followed the Chinese regime's narratives. Maybe the Chinese regime believes the WHO will be favorable to its personal interests. And notably, the Chinese regime says the virus came from the United States. That was their first claim, saying it was brought to China during the October war games in Wuhan. Then they said it came from Italy. They called it the Italian coronavirus. Now they're saying it came from France. They're calling it the French virus. So the Chinese regime has been switching this back and forth the whole way. Notably, the original claim was that it came from the Hunan seafood market, and they even in China were calling it the Wuhan virus. And of course that is being touted now as a racist statement, even though the Chinese regime itself was using that originally. At the same time, the United States is not backing away from holding the Chinese regime responsible. So Navarro said in an interview on ABC, quote, "The virus was spawned in Wuhan province. Patient 0 was in November." And he continued, quote, "The Chinese, behind the shield of the World Health Organization for 2 months, hid the virus from the world and then sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese on aircraft to Milan, New York, and around the world to seed that." Also, 8 countries, including the United States, Canada, Germany, France, and Japan, called out the WHO for not allowing Taiwan's entry into the WHO. They're saying Taiwan's exclusion from the WHO created a serious public health concern during this current pandemic. And notably, the WHO declined Taiwan's entry because doing so, they said, would violate the Chinese Communist Party's One China policy. In other words, allowing Taiwan into the WHO when Taiwan, just as all countries, is dealing with the pandemic, would mean violating the Chinese regime's established law, one that is not recognized by many countries outside of China. But again, this means that countries are not letting the Chinese regime off the hook on this, and they're not letting the WHO off the hook on this, because this shows that the WHO is putting politics above health. And so what is the Chinese regime saying about this? Well, they're using strong-arm tactics. Here's from The Guardian. Taiwan must accept Chinese status to attend WHO, says Beijing. Notably, one of the Chinese regime's main objectives is what they call reunification, which means they want to bring Taiwan under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Taiwan is still recognized by many countries as an independent country, and the Chinese regime wants to do away with that. First off, by denying it recognition as an independent country, which it has done in many parts of the world, and second, by bringing it fully under the leadership of the Chinese regime. And so the Chinese regime is saying that if Taiwan wants into the WHO, it must accept Chinese status. And also, as I briefly mentioned before, it is now being confirmed. The Chinese regime destroyed virus samples after this outbreak happened. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Quote, "China told labs to destroy coronavirus samples to reduce biosafety risks." That's how they're framing it. Why would having virus samples at a laboratory produce a biosafety risk if it did not originate from the laboratories? And if the laboratories notably were doing legitimate research into finding a cure? If they were researching to find a cure to viruses like this, which they were claiming they were doing, why would they need to destroy the research? Why would they need to destroy the vials? Wouldn't they want to keep those so they could possibly find a cure when a pandemic happens, why would they do that? Right? Some questions to consider. My own analysis, of course, take it for what it is, but questions to consider. This is a quote from the Wall Street Journal. A senior Chinese official appeared to confirm Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's allegation that Beijing had told labs in the country to destroy coronavirus samples in early January, but slammed his characterization as misleading. So the Chinese regime's narrative is this was done to reduce biosafety risks, not to cover up evidence. Now, a few other news updates, and we'll jump into questions from some of our viewers. First off, South China Morning Post is reporting that China's aggressive approach to coronavirus criticism is not working. And notably, advisors inside and outside China are pointing this out. The Chinese regime again has this new policy of wolf warrior diplomacy. They're being extremely aggressive and it is backfiring on them. And so how is the Chinese regime reacting to this? Well, all signs point to them doubling down, and it appears also trying to ignore different calls to discuss. So here is Australia's 9 News. It says, quote, China not returning trade ministers' phone calls. And this is from the Press Trust of India. Bar Association urges PM Modi to amend law to allow citizens to seek damages from China. In other words, changing the law so they can sue the Chinese regime for this outbreak and for covering it up. And the New York Post is reporting New Yorkers seek justice with class action coronavirus lawsuits against China. And so New Yorkers are joining people in other parts of the U.S. now filing class action lawsuits against the Chinese regime. Now that said, let's move on to some questions from viewers. First off, we have Kevin. There is no second wave. The first wave didn't end, just covered up. Kevin, thank you. Many of you actually pointed this out as well. And you're right, I should make this distinction. It is unlikely the first wave outbreak in China ever ended. And so the idea that a second wave outbreak is taking place is a bit of a, it's a propaganda campaign the Chinese regime is launching. It does appear to be the case. It's difficult because honestly I have to make this distinction every single time I do the broadcast, and people get bored if I repeat information too much. And so I've been trying to balance this. But yes, that is the case. I'll explain it briefly again. Remember how the narrative of the virus ending in China began. Here's what happened. The Chinese regime was treating this as the most serious issue in the country. There were an increasing number of cases. It was the biggest story in China, the biggest story around the world. Then what happened? The head of the Chinese regime, Xi Jinping, came out and said it's time for people to go back to work. The Chinese regime had determined that within a very short time span, about 1/3 of businesses in China are about to go under, and shortly after that another 1/3 are about to go under. And so what happened? Right after the announcement came out, the Chinese state media said the virus is over, it is now safe to go back to work. And so it went from one day saying this is the biggest issue in China, stay in your homes, we're going to barricade you in your homes with, metal bars at some points, to it's all good, nothing to see here, go back to work, you're all safe. And the Chinese regime tried opening it up, but things again have flipped and they're seeing the virus is not over with. Very likely the Chinese regime itself was aware of this from the get-go, but reopened it regardless. And now we have local governments again bringing new lockdowns into place. It's difficult to know what to call this because, what do we call it? A second wave lockdowns. How about that? I'll think of something. But yeah, you're all right. I should make this distinction when mentioning that. Moving on from Ursus Luxton. Josh, I've watched your show over the last 6 weeks. I do not see or hear your content as either racist or hateful, but rather you're reporting on the racism and oppressive acts and totalitarian policies of the CCP. It is the CCP who is racist and committing crimes against humanity, and China is using soft guerrilla warfare against all nations. Ursus, thank you. Notably, the mention of whether this is hateful content is in reference to YouTube labeling some of our content as being hateful content and denying us advertising based on that. Now on that note, you'll all be glad to hear that the main video that was labeled as hateful content by YouTube has been changed. In other words, it appears that a YouTube reviewer must have gone in after and determined, after the initial review, that it was not in fact hateful content. And so they lifted that restriction on that video. That said, these videos tend to be restricted from the get-go. A lot of our videos, here's how YouTube censorship works on the basic level. A lot of times you'll publish videos, and if they're on contentious topics, they will automatically have advertisements banned. You have to put in a manual request so that someone will go in and review it, which often takes several days. And for most people who are on YouTube channels, such as this one, a lot of times that means that the main traffic on that video is already come and gone. In other words, it's very hard to make money because of that. And so YouTube still censors us in that way. It's good at least that they're not labeling us as hateful content. So I was glad to see that shift at least. But again, we are still being censored to an extent. Now, moving on to Fret Not, Trust in God. Joshua, thank you so much for enduring and bringing us well-organized, fresh news from the trenches. God bless and protect you, your family, co-workers, and your home. Yeah, thank you very much. A lot of you leave very, very kind feedback, and it's very encouraging. I really appreciate it. The whole team appreciates it. I wish I could thank you all individually. Sometimes you'll notice I jump into the comments during the live broadcasts and do try to thank everyone individually, but I feel a bit goofy sometimes because all I'm saying is thank you over and over again. But really, genuinely, folks, thank you. I really appreciate the ongoing support. It means a lot to me, a lot to our team. So yeah, really, thank you. And also from Smart Center, dear Joshua, please, could you explain to us why there is no trade embargo against China, since they are as bad as North Korea? There are some trade restrictions with China. Really, there was nothing too major, too serious until Trump came in. I know, we don't like him. I don't want to get into the whole politics of that, but really, the U.S.-China trade war, Trump really did start cracking down on the Chinese regime, putting tariffs into place, putting sanctions into place. It seems to be working, at least in my analysis. Some people may argue otherwise. Now, notably, the idea of free trade with China, the Chinese Communist Party, goes back to the days of Richard Nixon, where basically to split the Soviet-Chinese or Chinese Communist Party alliance, he went and negotiated with China. This was during the Amur Valley conflict when Russia and China, the Soviet Union and China, were having a hot war. They were, having a real war in the Amur Valley. The analysis at that time was that the United States could not take on both the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party. And so Nixon basically went in and made these trade deals with China to break the Soviet-Chinese alliance. Now, of course, there's different analysis on what Nixon's real intentions were on that, and there's also different analysis on whether the Soviets were aware of what was really going on. But the point here is that whether it was Nixon, George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr., Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, they all pretty much agreed that they wanted to maintain open trade with China. There was different forms of analysis on that, one of the main ones being that being a communist country, bringing the Chinese regime into the global capitalist economy would somehow make the Chinese regime less communistic and more free. That changed over time. The opposite really happened. The Chinese regime extended its systems of state ownership pretty much into external businesses in external countries. One Belt, One Road is an example of this. And notably as well, I think it came from a misunderstanding of socialism and communism. Socialism and communism, they don't get rid of capitalism. They just bring the capitalist systems under state control. There's no communist society that's ever gotten rid of the factories. No communist society has ever gotten rid of the big businesses. No socialist country's ever gotten rid of these. The closest we could even argue would be Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where they took people out to the killing fields and forced them to work in the fields as farmers. But you could argue also that state farming, or state-sanctioned farming, was itself a big business. And so the Chinese regime getting access to the global markets only brought about its ability to use, for example, state-funded companies to undercut free markets. And in other words, because they're being state-subsidized, they can undercut, charge below even cost, undercut competitors, take over markets, and then charge whatever they want. And the Chinese regime has basically been taking advantage of the global economy through the system from the get-go. The world now is waking up to this. I think finally people are seeing through it. Many countries, not just the United States, are holding the Chinese regime responsible. Many countries are pulling factories and businesses and supply chains out of China, such as Japan even financing companies to pull out. India is doing the same thing. And the US also talking about new sanctions as well as what's currently in place. So things are changing, finally. Now that said, folks, let me know what you think in the comments below. Agree with me, disagree with me. You think I'm missing information, let me know. I do read the comments. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, we really need your support on this channel. And that said, folks, again, please take care of yourselves. Stay healthy. And we'll see you next time.